Welcome to today's talk on sharing place and sharing power with animals, held by Farm for Change at the Institute of European and American Studies, Academia Sinica. My name is Qianyi Lu. I am a political scientist here at the Institute. Farm for Change is an idea lab of the Institute of European and American Studies. It's a social science humanity interdisciplinary project that focuses on climate change and other pressing ecological and environmental issues. Farm for Change has since its birth a little over a year ago, Farm for Change has invited many great speakers who have given enlightening talks for which we have gotten many positive feedbacks. We tend to invite people whose ideas and research have really shaken the way we think or the way we see the world. Using these ideas and insights as seeds, we hope to farm for change. And of course, we do actually have a real organic farm on the rooftop of our institute. You can find all the past talks at the Farm for Change website. Today's speaker is definitely someone whose ideas and research have shaken the way we think, particularly about how to better organize our societies. Dr. Will Kymlicka is the Canada Research Chair in Political Philosophy in the Philosophy Department at Queen's University in Canada. His work on liberalism, democracy, diversity, and social justice, which so far includes 8 books and over 200 articles, have been translated into 34 languages. As a world-renowned influential thinker, he has also received many awards, including most recently the Order of Canada in 2023 for his outstanding contributions to the world. To many of us, Dr. Kymlicka was best known for his pioneering work on multiculturalism. In fact, it's quite impossible for anyone to have a serious discussion about multiculturalism without mentioning Dr. Will Kymlicka. However, his research on citizenship and social justice got even more fascinating when he pointed out the fact that our societies consist of not just human members, but also other animal species. He then went on to construct a groundbreaking political theory of animal rights, and together with Sue Donaldson wrote the book Zoopolis. Here. And the Chinese version, it's 动物公民. And this is one of my favorite books of all time. And that's why I probably should stop right here before going on for too long. Dr. Kymlicka will be talking for around 40-45 minutes, followed by a Q&A session of around 20-30 minutes. We will record the first part of the event and stop recording when the Q&A session begins. We will later upload the video with Chinese subtitle to both the YouTube channel of the Institute of European and American Studies and the Farm for Change website. So you can come back to watch the video, and also please share with your friends and colleagues who can't make it today. So now please join me in welcoming Dr. Will Kymlicka. So the mic is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction and for the invitation. It's great to be with you, if only by video. And it's great to be part of the Farm for Change project. So this is work that I'm doing with Sue Donaldson. So I'm just going to share my screen. I have some PowerPoint slides to accompany the talk, and I hope that'll be. Yes, there we go. Can everyone see that?
Yes, clearly.
Okay, great. Yeah, so this is work that I'm doing with Sue Donaldson, and it might be helpful to just say a bit about the background. So Sue and I think that the fundamental problem in our relations with animals is a problem of political exclusion. And we distinguish political exclusion from moral exclusion. So for the past 30 or 40 years or more, many animal advocates and animal ethicists have focused on the idea of getting animals into the moral circle. So Peter Singer famously said that the task is to expand the moral circle to include animals. And in our view, that's had some success. I think many people, perhaps most people today, would agree that animals have moral status, that they are in the moral circle. But as soon as you look at politics, animals are almost entirely excluded. So to my knowledge, there are no political communities around the world in which animals are represented, in which they're seen as members or citizens or stakeholders. They're almost entirely excluded from political decision making. And this shouldn't really be surprising, because one could argue that, at least in the Western tradition, politics has been seen as precisely what distinguishes humans from other animals. So according to this widely accepted view, going back at least to Aristotle, animals are part of nature and are therefore just governed by biological imperatives, whereas humans are able to rise above our animality and enter a realm of freedom precisely through politics. Politics is the vehicle by which we exercise collective freedom and make choices about how we want to live, and that's what puts us above animals who are stuck in their biological determination. So we have really at least 2,000 years of what we would call this human exceptionalist view of politics as something that only humans can do, and that what makes us superior to animals is our capacity for politics. And the predictable result of this, we would argue, is we exercise tyrannical rule over animals, that the way we engage in politics imposes huge costs and burdens on animals who are excluded from political decision making. Of course, we're not the only people who've come to this conclusion. There's now many people who have argued that we need to rethink our idea of politics and try to conceptualize a more than human politics. So in the work I'm doing with Sue, we're trying to think of what this would specifically mean in the relation to animals. So what are the different ways we could try to bring animals into politics? And so we're distinguishing three different models of how to bring animals into politics. So the first we could call politics on behalf of animals. And so the idea here would be that we would appoint a human to speak for animals in human politics. I'll discuss some examples of that later on. So that's politics on behalf of animals. We might also ask about the ways in which animals themselves engage in politics and engage in their own forms of collective decision making, that animal pods, herds, flocks, different communities of animals make collective decision making, and we could try to make space for their forms of collective decision making. So that's politics by animals. And then the third option, it's the one that Sue and I are in a way most interested in, is whether we can do politics with animals. Is it possible to do politics jointly with animals, or doing politics together? So basically in the talk, I want to say a bit about all three of these, but focus on the third. So the first, so this is politics on behalf of animals. So if you think about it, every day around the world, all sorts of decisions are being made that govern the lives of animals, that harm them, kill them, confine them, affect their environment, destroy their habitat, all sorts of ways in which decisions impact on animals. But virtually none of those decisions are in response to the animal's own interests. So we govern animals in ways that do not track their interests. And that's the classical definition of tyranny. That what distinguishes legitimate rule from tyrannical rule is whether power is exercised in the interests of those being governed. And animals today are not governed in accordance with their interests, they're governed in accordance with human interests. So how do we change that? So one possibility is we appoint human representatives to speak on behalf of animals in political processes. And there are some modest examples of this that actually exist around the world. So in the canton of Zurich, they appointed an animal advocate, a lawyer, whose task was to speak up for animals in relation to a range of animal welfare issues. The Los Angeles City Council had a similar position of an animal advocate. I call those modest because in most cases they had a purely advisory role. They didn't actually have any real power or decision making, but they did advise decision makers. But you could imagine more ambitious models, and people have proposed more ambitious models. So one might be to have an ombudsperson at the national level who would have the authority to evaluate whether every proposed law harms the interests of animals, harms the rights of animals, and perhaps if the ombudsman decides that a proposed law violates the rights of animals, it would then be struck down or deferred. Or even more ambitiously, you could imagine setting aside seats in the national parliament. So you might say 5 seats in the national parliament would be set aside for people whose job would be to speak for animals and to vote on in parliament for what they view animals' interests are. And I mentioned here a number of authors who have made serious proposals, either about ombudspersons or parliamentary seats. There are lots of difficult practical questions about how you might institutionalize these ambitious models. One question is, so if you think about representatives in a parliament, for example, would they be appointed or would they be elected? And if they're elected, by whom would they be elected? Would every citizen vote for the animal representatives, or only those who are known to have some special concern or knowledge of animals' interests, like veterinarians or animal advocates? So that's one question, is how are these people picked? But there's also questions about accountability. If we have these animal representatives in Parliament who are supposed to talk on behalf of animals, what's to prevent them from just making decisions based on their own self-interest? How do we hold people accountable for acting on behalf of animals, and who would do that? So these are really serious, important practical questions about the idea of appointing someone to speak on behalf of animals. And it's interesting to think about how we can overcome those practical problems. I think there are solutions to them. But for Sue and I, there's 2 deeper problems. It's not just practical questions. I think there are 2 deeper problems with this model, at least if it's the main model for including animals in politics. One is that it seems to simply take for granted that humans exercise sovereignty over animals, that we have the right to be making decisions that impact on animals. Of course, according to these models, we should take animals' interests into account when governing them, but it seems to simply take as a given that we have the right to govern animals, so long as we take their interests into account. And so Dinesh Wadiwal calls this the assumption of sovereignty, that we just assume human sovereignty over animals. And he argues that this is really this is where the problem arises, is this assumption of sovereignty, and that that whenever humans just take as a given that they have the right to exercise sovereignty over animals, that leads us down the slippery slope to domination. So I think we should put in question this assumption that we somehow have the right to be governing animals. Another problem is that many of these models for appointing a human to speak on behalf of animals, they're often justified on the grounds that animals are themselves incapable of political agency, that they're fundamentally incompetent. they're voiceless, and therefore they need humans to act on their behalf. And of course, that's a very long stereotype, at least in the Western tradition, again, going back to Aristotle, that animals are these fundamentally incompetent, passive, voiceless beings. And I think we should want to challenge that as well. So a different model, the second model we talk about, starts from the kind of opposite end and starts from the assumption that animals are competent political agents. And our task is then to look out and see, well, where do animals engage in politics? How do they engage in politics? And how can we recognize and acknowledge the ways in which they are always already engaging in political agency? So if we start from that perspective, there's actually a lot of really interesting evidence in ethology, in the science of animal behavior, which shows that many wild animals, contrary to Aristotle, are not governed solely by instinct. They're not governed solely by biological imperatives, that they actually exhibit what biologists call flexibility. They're able to make different kinds of choices, lead different kinds of lives, and that different communities of the same species may in fact behave in different ways because of this flexibility. And when we're thinking about social animals, groups that live in herds and pods and flocks and so on, then they face the task, they face the necessity of coordinating their flexible behavior at the collective level. When animals live together in groups, just like when humans live together in groups, there's often the need to make binding decisions. So you've got these individuals who can live different lives, who have flexibility, but collectively they need to coordinate. And that means there must be mechanisms by which a community of animals, a group of animals, make collective decisions that are accepted as binding for all of the members, even though they may have different interests and preferences. So from our point of view, that's what politics is. Politics just is the process of making collective decisions that is binding on a group. And social animals of many species need to engage in politics because they need to make collective decisions in the face of flexibility. Okay, and so scientists have been studying what are the mechanisms by which animals make political decisions? How do they make collective decisions? And it's actually a really fascinating field for those who are interested. One example is some animal communities use a version of what we might call federalism. So they have these fission-fusion processes that on some issues, when the conflicts between individuals get too strong, you'll have groups break out. They'll separate, so that's fission, and they'll form their own self-governing group for at least certain purposes. But then they'll come back and rejoin the larger group for other purposes. So it's like a federal state and there's a sub-state government and a central government. So too, wild animals engage in fission and fusion in order to accommodate plurality, but also the need for common decisions. Some wild animal communities have these rules about quorum, about how many animals need to agree. So if it's a group of 30 animals, how many of them need to express their agreement to make a decision to move in this direction rather than that direction. This fascinating study about how prairie dogs make these quorum rules about decisions about movement. And it's also important to note, contrary to many myths, that there isn't a single authority structure within many wild animal communities, that you have different rules for making decisions and different authority structures in relation to, for example, food distribution, than for decisions about movement, mobility, than for decisions about sex and reproduction. So there's not a single dominance hierarchy. You have different authorities in relation to different issues. So all of which is just to say that there's really fascinating work. Once we think about animals as political agents who make collective decisions, there's a lot of really interesting work that's being done to identify their politics. But there's also, and more importantly, growing evidence about how important it is to respect their political decision processes if they are to flourish as wild animal communities. So in the field of conservation, this is leading to a real sea change in the way people think about conservation. So in the past, it used to be thought that what was central to conservation was reproductive potential. So you wanted to focus on younger members because they were most likely to reproduce, and reproduction was the key to survival. But what we now know is that for many wild animal communities, it's actually the older members of the community who are really crucial, because they're the ones who have knowledge, they're the ones who have authority, they play a central role in these political processes of decision making. And that therefore, what can be most disruptive to a wild animal community is not the death of a young member, it's the death of an old member. So if one of the adult elephants in a herd, for example, is killed, that is what can lead to dissolution of the group, and the younger elephants go rogue, as it's said, and they start to harm other members of the community or other animals or humans, because they're not subject, because the authority scheme has broken down. And so that suggests that when we think about our relations with wild animals, we might think of them as nations. We might think of them as self-governing groups or nations with rights of self-determination. So Karen Bradshaw has argued this in relation to elephants. So we should think of ourselves as having a nation-to-nation relationship with elephants who have their own political structures that we should respect, and that our relationships with them should therefore be on this nation-to-nation model of a kind of diplomacy, international diplomacy. Okay, so this is obviously a very different idea about how to bring animals into politics than the first one. The first model about politics on behalf of animals often starts with the idea that animals are passive, they're voiceless, they lack agency, and therefore we need humans to speak on their behalf. Whereas the second model starts from the assumption, the exact opposite assumption, that animals are competent political actors, they make decisions, they form their own self-governing communities, and we should respect their collective self-government. Okay, so these are two different views that are out there. I mean, my own view is that there's a role for both of them. We do need representatives to speak on behalf of animals, and we also need to think about wild animal communities as competent political actors who form their own self-governing communities. But neither of these models on their own tells us whether politics is something we can do together with animals. So on the first model, politics is only done by humans, some of whom speak on behalf of animals. In the second model, it's animals who engage in politics, and humans are not a part of that. So what Sue and I are interested in is, can we make sense of the idea of politics as something that humans and animals do together? Can humans and animals co-author political decisions? So we call that joint politics. And so we're interested in the question whether joint politics is possible, and is it necessary? So just to summarize, our idea, at least at the moment, is that joint politics is not always possible and it's not always necessary, but it is necessary whenever humans and animals are entangled in particular ways. And we're focused on two ways in which humans and animals can become entangled. So in some cases, humans and animals are entangled because they share a social world. They share interspecies sociability. And by sociability here, I mean trust, cooperation, communication. So this is something we have with domesticated animals. That's almost by definition. Domestication just is bringing animals into our social world so that they can live and work alongside us. So we share a thick social world with domesticated animals that entangles us in shared social practices, social norms. We don't have that relationship, that social relationship, with many animals, indeed, arguably with most wild animals. But even when we don't have this thick social relationship with animals, we may nonetheless be entangled with them because we share the same physical space. So if you think about wild animals in the city, urban wildlife, so I'm not sure what the wild animals are in Taipei, but here where I live, you think about raccoons, many birds. Think about mice, rats, pigeons, squirrels. So we don't have social relations with many of those animals, but we share the same physical environment. They may be in our backyards. They may be on the roof of our buildings. They may be in our city parks. Okay, so our idea is that wherever humans and animals are entangled socially through interspecies sociability or physically through sharing space and place, the more we need to learn how to do politics together. Not just politics on behalf of, not just humans talking on behalf of animals and not just animals governing on their own. We need to do politics together. So if that's right, that implies that at least there are some cases where we probably don't need to be doing joint politics. And we think this is clearest in the case of what we call truly wild animals or wilderness animals. So, at least in some parts of Canada, there are animals who live very remote from humans, live on their own habitat, far from human settlement. And there, it's probably enough that we leave them to be self-governing and we appoint someone to speak on their behalf, but we don't need to learn how to do joint politics with them. But in relation to domesticated animals that we've brought into our society, and in relation to what we call liminal wild animals, the wild animals who live amongst us in areas of human settlement, I think we do need to learn how to do joint politics. So what would that mean? So we've been looking at two kind of real world examples of joint politics. The first is farmed animal sanctuaries. So as many of you know, these are sanctuaries that were set up for animals who've been rescued from factory farming generally. So these may be cows, pigs, sheep, geese, chickens. And sanctuaries offer them the opportunity to live out their lives in peace. But many of the people who run these sanctuaries are committed to the idea that animals should be able to make choices about how they want to live as they live out the rest of their life. And so they're confronted with a whole series of questions about how to organize the life of this sanctuary to make it suitable for these rescued farmed animals. So, for example, what kind of social relationships do these farmed animals want to have? For example, do pigs just want to hang out with other pigs? Or do pigs want to hang out also with the chickens, with the cows, with the sheep, or with the humans? So this question about, like, do animals want to hang out just with members of their own species or with other species? We need to find that out. And there is no way to find that out without asking the animals. And so what Sue and I have done, we've gone to some of these farmed animal sanctuaries and just tried to examine how this process, how these decisions are made. And we suggest we can understand these farmed animal sanctuaries as sites, micro-sites, in which joint politics is taking place. The humans make proposals to the animals about how to organize the physical space, the buildings, which spaces should be reserved for which animals, for which activities. But the animals also make proposals to the humans. They just sometimes appropriate bits of the land. They make proposals about what social relationships they want to have, what activities they want to engage in. And so we can see a complex process of proposing, responding, resisting, negotiating. That's joint politics. And we think we can see it in farmed animal sanctuaries. A different example we've been looking at involves liminal, what we call liminal animals, the kind of urban wildlife, and how urban design is being changed to take into account liminal animals. So people used to think of cities as being designed by and for humans, and that wild animals didn't belong in the city. But it's increasingly recognized that urban wildlife, this is their home. Cities are their home. They have nowhere else to go. And they have a right to be there. They have a right to the city. And so that means we need to rethink urban design. And that too can be understood as a process of proposals and responses, that humans make proposals to the urban wildlife about spaces, about things like overpasses, about city parks, about how to design buildings. And then the animals respond, but so too, the wild animals make their proposals to us, to humans, and the policymakers, the designers respond to the proposals of the urban animals. And so these are two examples in which we think you can see real world processes of joint politics, of communicating, negotiating, proposing, responding, resisting. That means that we can describe these as decisions that are co-authored at their best. So those are just two examples, but I would argue actually that there's many, many examples of joint politics. Actually, as soon as you think about it, there are just countless ways in which both domesticated animals and liminal animals are constantly engaged in communication with us, making proposals to us, engaged in resistance to us, all of which we can see as forms of politics, and so too in our relationship with them. So I actually think joint politics isn't rare, it's not exceptional, it's all around us. Unfortunately, most of the time, most people just don't even see it. Even though it's all around us, we don't see it as politics. We don't see it as joint politics. And I think that's partly because of theoretical blinders. So I'm a political theorist, so perhaps I'm particularly interested in the way in which our theoretical ideas get in the way of us seeing what's actually there around us. So in our work, we're focused on two theoretical blinders that prevent people from seeing joint politics. The first is the idea we've inherited of political community. So at least in the Western tradition, we've inherited this idea of political community as inherently unitary and exclusive. And what I mean by that, this is sometimes called the Westphalian vision of political community. What I mean by that is the assumption that that for any piece of territory, any piece of land around the world, it should belong to one and only one political community. So you stick your finger on a map and you should be able to say that piece of land belongs to one and only one political community. That's what I mean by unitary and exclusive. So I think there's a growing recognition that even in relation to humans, that's not an adequate account of political community. So when people think about Northern Ireland, for example, or Jerusalem, I think it's pretty clear that we need to think of these territories as belonging to at least two political communities. So that Northern Ireland belongs in some sense both to Ireland and to England. Jerusalem belongs both to Israel and to Palestine. We need to learn for the possibility that there are overlapping political communities on the same piece of land. But Sue and I would argue that that's even more true in relation to animals. That we need to think about, once we bring animals into politics, then we need to think about there being overlapping political communities on the same territory. So just to make this concrete, think about cities. So we've sometimes used the example of New York, but I suspect this would be true about Taipei. So think about any city. On our view, we should think of that city as a home to two overlapping types of political community. On the one hand, there's what we could consider a kind of thick political community based on ideas of citizenship and that comes with a set of rights and responsibilities that's tied to the idea of sharing a social world. We are members of a social community. And again, social in terms of trust, communication, cooperation, this kind of thick social bond. And so we would argue that humans and domesticated animals are co-citizens of a shared social world. And so we should view the domesticated animals who live in the city as our co-citizens and as belonging to a shared political community based on social membership. But that's not the only political community that exists in the city. We would argue that the city should also be seen as an interspecies commons, which is also home not just to the humans and the domesticated animals, but also to urban wildlife. So we should think about the territory of the city, not just as a social community, but as a commons, a territorial commons, a physical commons, if you like, an ecological commons, if you like, and that all of us, the humans, the domesticated animals, the liminal animals, all of us are denizens of this shared commons. So the city, so like Taipei is a city, it's both a social community formed of humans and domesticated animals, and it's a commons that includes humans, domesticated animals, and wild animals. And we have rights and responsibilities both as citizens of a social community and as denizens of a commons. And in our view, at least the Western tradition of political theory has said a lot, a very sophisticated theory about our rights and responsibilities as citizens of a social community. That's what Western political theory has talked about for 2,000 years. But I think it's clear to everyone today, in light of the climate catastrophe, that we also need to think much more about our rights and responsibilities as denizens of a commons. And that's a commons that we share with animals as well, including wild animals. So we're interested in our work going forward to think about how to think about these two overlapping communities: citizenship in a social, based on social membership, and denizenship based on an interspecies common, and how those overlap in places like cities. Okay, that's the first theoretical blinder. The second is about our idea of political agency. So to include animals in politics, at least on the model of joint politics or the model of politics by animals, we need to find a way to think about animals as engaging in political agency. But we've inherited, again, at least in the Western tradition, a picture of political agency as one that's highly intellectual, highly cognitive. It's about having certain ideas in your brain that you then formulate and communicate through human speech. And so many people assume that animals can't engage in political agency. It's too cognitively sophisticated for animals to engage in, but so too some humans on this model can't engage in political agency. Children, for example, or people with cognitive disabilities. So that's the old idea of political agency that we've inherited, but that's being challenged in the theoretical literature by a newer idea of political agency, which is often called a distributed idea of political agency. And the idea here is that political agency doesn't just emerge fully formed inside the brain of each of us, but it actually emerges, it's co-produced with others, and it depends on whether others are willing and able to give us uptake. So we express our subjectivity in a variety of ways, verbal and nonverbal. And then the question is, are there others out there who have uptake of our agency, who are willing to be the bearers and holders of our agency? And so on this idea, what's crucial to being an effective agent is that you have the right kind of holding environment, that the physical environment we live in and the social environment we live in is full of others who are willing to be the bearers and holders of our agency. So that's probably quite abstract. So let me just give you an example that people talk about in literature. So as you all know, human beings are quite attached to our home. And why are we so attached to the idea of home and to our specific, the homes we live in? Many people are arguing it's because the home reminds us who we are, that our identity is not something located fully in our brain. Actually, our identity is externalized in the home. And so when we walk through the home and we see photographs, we see books, we see the furniture, it reminds us who we are. And so in that sense, the home is an extended mind. Our identity exists in our physical environment, and so the home serves as a bearer and holder of our identity and our agency. We would not be effective agents if we could not rely on the home as holding our agency and as reminding us who we are. And people have argued the same thing collectively about public things. So Bonnie Honig argues that what she calls public things like public parks, monuments, public institutions like hospitals and schools, these are the extended mind of the community. They remind us who we are as a community. They remind us what brings us together. They remind us what we care about collectively. They serve as points of orientation that gives us effective and enduring identities and agencies. So again, agency is distributed through the environment, in the home, in public things, and in our fellow members of society. Okay, so we argue that all of that has been developed to think about humans' distributed agency, but we would argue it applies equally to the case of animals. That animals too, that their home, their habitat, serves as their extended mind, and they too have public things. They're joint things that serve as the orienting point for communities, for groups of animals. And I think so. If we adopt this idea of distributed political agency, I think that helps to explain when joint politics between humans and animals is possible and necessary. So if we go back to the case of these truly wild animals who live very far from humans, and we ask who are the bearers and holders of their agency, I think it's primarily members of their own species, and more specifically, members of their own group, their own herd, pod, flock. Those are the others who are needed to be the bearers and holders of their agency. But in the case of domesticated animals that we've brought into our society, and the liminal animals who live in the same physical spaces with us in areas of human habitation, that for those animals, humans too play a role as the bearers and holders of their agency. They're not going to be effective agents unless we take it upon ourselves to be responsive to their agency and take it upon ourselves to be part of the holding environment of their agency. And that's what's happening in farmed animal sanctuaries. The human caregivers are the bearers and holders of the identities and agencies of the farmed animals residents. And I think we can see that in the case of urban design, that the urban planners are, in their own way, we can see them as trying to be the bearers and holders of the agency of domesticated animals. Okay, so just to go back to this idea, and again, think about the city as our test case. We could think about cities as the site for overlapping political communities. And so a city is both a site of citizenship grounded in social membership. And so we think that would include both humans and domesticated animals because we've brought them into our society. And that kind of political community is grounded in quite thick forms of sociality in which the members share certain norms and practices, cooperative norms, and so on. And it's quite a comprehensive political community that provides a wide range of rights and duties and provides a wide range of resources and goods and benefits, including like a welfare state. So Sue and I argue that domesticated animals should also benefit from the welfare state. And it has as its goal a kind of proactive world making, that the people who share this thick social world take it upon themselves in politics to create the kind of world they want to live in. And in terms of political agency, humans are directly involved in supporting the political agency of domesticated animals through socialization and consultation and trust. So that's a quite thick and robust and expansive conception of political community. And that's the one that Western political theory is focused on. But we want to argue that that sits on top of this other political community that's thinner, but is equally important. And so we call this thinner political community the commons. And it's one that includes people who do not necessarily share thick sociability. It's a thinner relationship that's primarily grounded in toleration. We just need to learn to peacefully coexist on this shared commons. And we need to learn how to share the resources of that commons and to use them sustainably. And so to ensure some kind of ecological responsibility. And so politics for the commons is primarily a matter of kind of problem solving, about how to keep peace, how to ensure toleration amongst all the very different kinds of beings who coexist, who are denizens of the shared commons. And here we do have a role, humans have a role in supporting the political agency of animals, not through socializing them into a shared social world, but through observation and response. So we just think it's helpful to think of the city as having these two levels of political community, both of which are fundamental, and each needs to take into account the other. Okay, so just to sum up, we've distinguished here three different ways of thinking about bringing animals into politics. Politics on behalf of animals, human representatives who speak for animals, politics by animals, self-governing wild animal communities, and joint politics with animals. And we need all three. I actually think, once we distinguish these different ways of bringing into animals into politics, a whole world becomes possible. There's just so many different ways we can think about a more than human politics. But in order to take advantage of that world of possibilities, we think we need to overcome some of these inherited theoretical ideas about what politics is, what political community is, what political agency is. And that's what Sue and I are working on these days. Thank you. I look forward to your questions and comments.